Local officials and designers are trying to meet the challenge posed by climate change, and that especially means rising sea levels. One effort is the international competition called Living with Water. 3 winners were announced yesterday with ideas for the North End waterfront, Fort Point, and Dorchester. To talk about the competition is a member of the steering committee for Boston Living with Water, John Dalzell, and a member of the team that produced the Total Resiliency Plan for Dorchester. He's an architect with the Italian firm Francesco Lanza. Thank you both very much for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Fred.
I want to start with John. Give us the context for this here, because how drastic a change do we have to get ready for?
The competition envisions sea level rise and climate change to the end of the century, 2100. The best science right now forecasts that to be about a 5-foot rise in seas. That's a game changer for Boston. That means our low-lying areas will not be susceptible to storm inundation, but will be underwater twice a day with high tides.
Francesco, you're from Venice in Italy. That's a city that's really threatened. So talk about how that prepares you for what's happening in Boston.
Well, it was fascinating because we found many analogies between Venice and Boston. So we thought that many solutions which have been applied to Venice can be also proposed to solve many of the problems of Boston.
John, talk about the #1 winner here. Is this for the North End waterfront we're talking about, or the Fort Point area?
There were 3 sites, Chris, and they ranged in scale. So the first site is for a building scale solution, and that's the North End site. We actually had the good fortune of working with the former Prince Spaghetti building, which is now home to a bunch of lovely people. And so that set of challenges really looked at what we can do on a building scale basis. So how can we adapt buildings, and especially important for Boston, and I suppose for Venice, how do we adapt old buildings? Venice has many more older buildings than Boston. The second site focuses on what's referred to as the 100 acres. So it's the large vacant area next to Gillette on the 4-Point Channel. And that site also is a vulnerable site, and during, say, a lunar high tide, when the tide's at its highest, at the full moon once a month, portions of that site actually go underwater during the high tide. So that scale is really what we refer to as districts. So it involves many buildings, roadways, and a much bigger solution set, if you will. And then Morrissey Boulevard is what we refer to as an infrastructure site, where the solutions first really had to focus on broad-based infrastructure-grade solutions, as well as area solutions around buildings and public and open spaces.
Francesco, we're already familiar with the rising sea levels on Morrissey Boulevard. There are times when it's underwater, it has to be shut down. So what's your response to that in your design?
Well, the basic idea is to convert Morrissey Boulevard into a multifunctional infrastructure. So basically it will be a sort of urban seawall. Our project proposes to raise the boulevard at 18 feet and use the underneath space to create water tanks to store rainwater, so to increase the area resilience, and at the same time using the underneath space for urban facilities such as parkings, and so integrate the new infrastructure with the new built areas.
You also thought about the access between different parts of Dorchester, because there's a part of Dorchester, the Columbia Point Peninsula, that's on the east side. You have Savin Hill on the west side, and I guess you're thinking about maybe some new kinds of circulation here.
Connections are a key point of the project. We want to establish, we thought of Columbia Point as an extensive park connected with all Dorchester. So improve the JFK UMass station in order to create a new platform which will allow a direct connection with the inner neighborhoods, and at the same time connect also the Hill Coves with the near neighborhood.
Yeah. John, when I look at one of the visuals that go for the four-point channel design, I was very intrigued. I mean, on the one hand, you have these new buildings that are almost on platforms, and I'm thinking, well, what about those older buildings that are already there? What's going to happen with them?
Well, it's interesting because many of the solutions took some cues from the older buildings. We have a wonderful situation with buildings that front on Sumner Street. They're actually quite elevated, and they have back entries that are down 2 stories on the backside or along A Street. And so a lot of the schemes started to realize that Summer Street is part of the solution going forward. We need to raise roadways and we need to raise building entries. So the interface now, I think, and the challenge for us in dealing with new buildings and existing buildings is how do we help those buildings also retreat vertically is what we refer to it. How can they raise up? What kinds of uses can the lower floors be put to if they can't be made waterproof?
What about the Prince building? I saw that great blue heron just outside, and I'm saying, well, this is a different scenario here.
Sure. I think one of the really beautiful aspects of all the proposals was that they truly envision a much healthier harbor. And I think our history with the harbor is telling. We started a long time with a very dirty harbor. In the last 25 years, it's become quite clean. I think going forward, realizing how important the water is and its change as it rises up, the visions all called for an even healthier harbor, more wildlife, but more human access, more human presence. You know, maybe the return of beaches and marshes and things like that, which also play a role in the aquatic health of the harbor. So these are not just things of beauty, but they're also things that become part of a living shoreline, part of a healthy harbor.
Francesco, in Venice, part of the future is you just have to live with flooding too, right?
Well, the Moses system will partially control the flooding, so along its history, Venice always lived with water. So there's a history of a long time adaptation. So it's not a definitive solution. It's a sort of dynamic equilibrium which has to be found every time along it. Yes.
Thank you both very much, Francesco Lanza and John Dalzell from Austin Living with Water. We'll have more news in just a moment.